it's chaos on the old bridge because you get the coast road from Bentley, people going to work in Bangor, and of course the A5 joining as well.
We're involved in about an hour's queuing, an hour and a half in the summertime. The same in the evening when you return home from work. Sometimes we're up to 6:30 before you get over the bridge.
Between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning, it will possibly take you over half an hour.
And these traffic coming from Ireland, these big freight liners, they're pretty horrific.
For years and years, and each year getting worse, those who lived in or loved to visit the resorts of Anglesey had to pay dearly for the privilege.
It's really pretty grim for the local people who have to get back from work, you know, and there's a usual Bangor crawl.
Last Friday, it was Bangor, just like sort of Spaghetti Junction.
I live about a mile out and there are traffic jams right up to my house.
We've known queues right through from Menai Bridge right through Sandler.
It's been a pain in the neck for years now, and we've suffered a lot in Menai Bridge, actually, you know.
In the 19th century, two great structures were built across the Menai Strait. One was Stephenson's engineering masterpiece, the Britannia Rail Bridge. The other was for road traffic. The trouble was that Thomas Telford's magnificent suspension bridge, built in 1826 to carry the new A5 over to Holyhead, was never meant for traffic like this. The jams caused by the mixture of commuter and heavy goods traffic, complicated by holidaymakers in summer, often brought movement to a complete halt. Then, as so often happens, eventual salvation came about through a great disaster which occurred on the night of the 25th of May, 1970. Fire burned all night, and next morning, the second great structure across the strait, the Britannia Rail Bridge, was a smoking ruin. 120 years of history had been thrown away by a careless piece of lighted paper. It was difficult to believe that in time, the Britannia would rise like a phoenix from its own ashes. The story of the Great Bridge began in 1844, when the Chester and Holyhead Railway was incorporated to link Holyhead to the mainland. Robert Stephenson, whose famous father George had surveyed the line, was appointed engineer. His most formidable task was the bridging of the Menai Strait. The first conception was a massive central tower on Britannia Island, which, together with land towers on either side of the water, would support cast iron arches, each of 350 feet span and over 100 feet high at the center. But the Admiralty wouldn't allow it. It would interfere with navigation, they said. A suspension bridge wasn't practical either. It wasn't stiff enough to take a train. Although George Stephenson had once suggested that carriages could be pulled by horses over Telford's road bridge. That suggestion was to become ironical fact later on. Finally, Stephenson had a revolutionary idea. He asked his colleagues, Eaton Hodgkinson, Henry Fairbairn, and Edwin Clark, among others, to test his theories for a tubular bridge. After extensive studies, they all agreed it was feasible, and the great project was born. The box beams were to be over 450 feet in length and weighing around 2,000 tons apiece. The rectangular tube was strengthened above and below by a series of cells which ran the length of the tube. The cells were just wide enough for a slim man to crawl into to hold a rivet or paint the inside. The quiet banks of the Menai Strait were transformed as a small army of men and boys were assembled to work on the bridge. The building of the massive masonry towers, using stone carted from Penmon, was begun in September 1846. And for 3 years, the cut and dowelled blocks rose steadily higher over the water. It was decided to build the tubes on site. The platforms were set at just above high spring tide level, and rail tracks laid to carry the cranes for lifting the iron plates. When completed, the pontoons would be floated into excavations under the platforms. Stephenson's design called for the Britannia tubes to be raised 105 feet above water level to rest in slots in the towers. It was an unheard of procedure. But he had a useful dress rehearsal in 1848, when the much lighter tubes for the Conway Bridge were raised. Even here, the floating of the tubes wasn't without hazard due to the fast-flowing tide. But the complexity of the tide race in the Menai Strait, giving rise to the notorious swellies, was a much more formidable obstacle. The tubes had to be maneuvered on their pontoons over platforms at the base of the towers, on which they would be supported as the tide ebbed. On the 20th of June, 1849, the first tube was floated. In a high wind, it went dangerously fast. And when a check cable broke, nearly 2,000 tons of iron accelerated towards disaster. The foreman, Charles Rolfe, had the presence of mind to call to the gaping crowd on the banks. They laid hold on a 12-inch thick cable, and the monster was brought under control. Each tube was raised in stages by hydraulic jacks driven by huge reciprocating steam pumps set high in the towers. As the tube traveled up the slots in stages, it was supported from below. A wise precaution as it happened, for one day the bottom blew out of the cylinder of the pump and the tube fell 9 inches. Without the packing, it would have fallen to the bottom of the strait. Even so, it caused some loss of life and considerable damage. The second tube was lifted in 16 days, and the others followed without incident. The up and the down tubes were joined in the towers to make 2 continuous structures. Finally, on the 5th of March, 1850, Robert Stephenson himself drove in the last rivet. And the first test train passed between John Thomas's lugubrious lines. The train weighed 248 tons, and the deflection on each of the long tubes was less than 3/4 of an inch. The Britannia was born. The bridge, they said, was impossible to build. 20,000 tons of stone and nearly as much of iron, striding 1/3 of a mile across the Menai Strait. It was one of the marvels of the age, and its cost was proportional, £674,000, a vast sum in those days. The cost in lives was heavy too. Of those workmen who struggled in all weathers high over the water, winter and summer, 10 died. Incidentally, the surgeon who was in constant attendance at the site was paid by the men. A detail that was to become significant later, 120 years later, was the covering of timber and hessian coated with tar, which was used to preserve the tubes from the salt-laden atmosphere. But in the meantime, the bridge safely carried the Royal Mail, passengers and freight over to Holyhead. Until the night of the 25th of May, 1970. The timber and hessian covering had gone up like a torch, with the towers and tubes acting as chimneys to increase the draft. The wrought iron structure, which had borne the strain of 2 million trains, had cracked from top to bottom. The plates, red hot at the height of the blaze, had sagged. On one span, the deflection was 29 inches. In one night, the economy of Anglesey, of British Rail, and ultimately of the country, was placed under severe strain. The recently completed multi-million-pound container terminal at the port of Holyhead lay stranded and dead, as did hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of rolling stock. And one of George Stephenson's early proposals for the rail crossing came to tragic fruition when the rolling stock had to be hauled by road over Telford's Bridge to the mainland. It was essential that the rail crossing should be restored with a minimum of delay. So while the Royal Engineers hastily improvised Bailey Bridge sections to shore up the tubes, British Rail asked the consulting engineers, Husband and Company, to get to work immediately. By another irony of history, the concept arrived at was very much akin to Stephenson's first design. Using his tars, the rail deck would be borne on arches. The major difference would be that a road deck over the rails would ease the saturation traffic on the suspension bridge and its approaches. Bearings at the foot of the towers would ultimately carry the whole weight of the structure. The load on each stainless steel pin would be 2,500 tons. The approach spans consisted of longitudinal steel girders supported on reinforced concrete portal frames. The contractors for the first phase of reconstruction, the Cleveland Bridge Company, had the spandrel-braced arches constructed at Port Britannia and floated in sections to the site. Here, they were lifted into place, secured as cantilevers, and tied back as far as the lions on either side. The tricky weather conditions hadn't altered in the intervening century and a half, and the arduous task of erection was carried on in all states of the Welsh climate. As one of the steelmen said, this was the bridge that sorted the men out from the boys. But 18 months after the fire, the shape of the new Britannia was clear. Only the key section of the arch had to be positioned 100 feet above the water. The tubes were now supported by arches, and traffic was resumed on the upside tube. Anglesey's industry could come to life again after the long and expensive interim. The tubes could now be cut into sections and hauled away, sad remnants of an unsurpassed example of Victorian engineering. The openings in the towers now had to be enlarged to take the future road deck. But the new rail link into Anglesey was complete. Britannia was reborn from the flames. However, the work so far had only replaced what Stephenson had built. The new phase, the road deck, would be a completely new addition to the proud old structure. It seemed destined to go on making engineering history. Fairclough Civil Engineering Limited joined forces with Fairfield Mabey Limited to bid for the road deck contract. They won it, and the £6.4 million, 30-month-long job was started in late 1977. By the time the Secretary of State for Wales came to inaugurate the project in the early summer of the following year, preparations were well advanced.
What are you doing there now? Are you starting
Well, we're just starting to...
The shape of the new approach roads, linking the road bridge with the Bangor Fishguard Trunk Road on the mainland and the A5 on the Anglesey side, were already engraved into Welsh earth. The formwork for the Treborth Bridge, taking an old road over the new, was taking shape. The new road abutments were beginning to appear too. And with scarcely a pause for the captains and the kings to depart, Fairfield Mabey steelmen were back on the bridge. Extra stringers had to be laid at the side of the single rail track to take the service road, which was such a crucial factor in the reconstruction. British Rail's decision to operate only one track across the rebuilt bridge meant that the other, unused bed could be utilized for the carrying in of material and for cranes to lift steelwork into place on the road level above. Concrete slabs, precast at one of Fairclough's factories, began to reach out over the bridge. Throughout the autumn of 1978, the work continued. To the restrictions of space and the limited possession possible on a working line was now added worsening weather conditions on the exposed heights. Apart from the work on the bridge deck, Faircloughs were responsible for the approach works. This entailed, amongst other things, about 100,000 cubic meters of cut on the mainland, of which about 2/3 went to fill and 1/3 was cart away. In addition, about 25,000 cubic meters of soft material had to be replaced with imported rock. The muck was a hodgepodge of everything from soft peat to very hard rocks. Some limestone was so hard it had to be drilled, blasted, and broken up further by impact hammers. The Anglesey approach to the bridge was quite a different matter. About 100,000 cubic meters of material had to be found within the island itself to fill in behind the new abutment and form the embankment. The bridge itself was not the only site of activity. Fairfield Mabey fabricated all the steel for the contract at their works in Chepstow, 4,500 tons in all. Protection of the steel uses an expensive recipe. Shot blasting is followed by aluminium spray, etch primer, 2 coats of zinc chromate, and 2 of micaceous iron oxide. The steel was taken to the bridge by road and rail. The winter of 1978-9 was a severe one, and working conditions 130 feet above the icy waters were very difficult for the steelmen. The steelwork on the bridge itself was fairly straightforward. 600mm deep stringers spanning 8.4 meters between portal frames. But the land spans were difficult. Members were heavier and included welding as well as bolting. Geometry, particularly on the Anglesey spans, was complicated because of the simultaneous tapering and curving of the bridge approaches. But the biggest restriction of all was that imposed by having to work over and alongside a mainline railway. Much of the lifting and placing of steel could be done only between midnight on Saturday and noon on Sunday. Lowering the portal legs down through to their base plates and securing each with 6 bolts was no problem over the arch spans. Each leg here weighs only 5 tons. The crossbeam follows. And then the stringers can be placed. The crane moves on to the next section and the stringers can be skated into their final positions. Bolting up can be done later. But on the side spans, steel erection was a much more complex business. The road deck supports had been designed so that a derailment could knock out 1 portal leg on the side spans and 2 on the arch spans without collapsing the entire structure. But this design also meant that 1 of each pair of portals had to be tilted out of plumb during a track possession, and the stringers, each with a temporary resting piece and a roller bearing, set up. The portal is then brought back to plumb, and connections between stringers and frames make the stringers effectively continuous. A typical night possession. A tricky operation is about to be conducted. An 81-ton portal beam for the Anglesey approach span has arrived by rail. The Olympus crane, which had to be brought on site dismantled in 12 trucks, lifts the beam onto a low loader. Restrained by a winch, the load is taken down a 1-in-5 ramp, specially built by fair clubs for the job. The huge crane laboriously follows and changes its track width for the lift.
That's okay. Thanks so much.
The majority of fixings consisted of friction grip bolts. There were about 10,000 of them in the contract. A certain amount of welding was required too. All the steel erection had to coincide with the civil engineering work on the abutments. The beam seating area on the abutments had to carry the heavier stringers used on the approach spans. A nice gesture to tradition and to the bridge's history. The contract called for masonry from the portals of the old bridge to be sliced into 125mm thick slabs and used as a facing for the new abutments. Through the bitter winter and the spring of 1979, the steelwork progressed over the bridge and the civil works followed. Permanent formwork was used on the arch and side spans. For the approach spans, however, Fairclough's decided to use temporary formwork. Close boarding between the stringers effectively isolated the road deck from the railway below, enabling more continuous working. Over the arch and side spans, the permanent formwork consisted of special GRP panels, stiffened with steel strip and angle. It's a big deck, some 14,000 square meters, and it required about 400 miles of reinforcing bar. By July, the steelwork was complete and concreting well underway. Tony Freeman of Fairfield Maybe could make his last Tour de Britannia, whilst an aerial run clearly illustrates those curved and tapered approaches he had to contend with. By this time, too, the Treborth Bridge was in operation. The approach roads and embankments are more clearly defined. The sub-base has been graded and rolled, ready for the blacktop. It's time for curb laying. By the end of July, blacktopping had begun on the mainland approaches. While down the straight, the heavy load of slow-moving summer traffic over Telford's Bridge underscores the necessity of this new route into Anglesey. On the bridge road deck, the concreting of the lower half of the parapet using travelling gantries was underway. There's a total length of 850 metres each side. But concrete wasn't always poured on sunny days. There was, after all, 21,000 tons of it. Through another hard winter and into the new year, the work went relentlessly on against the clock. Not only the deck pouring, but finishing the parapet with the aid of custom-built shutters designed to produce an elegantly curved profile. Lighting column support boxes, cast on site, were just one of a myriad details to be taken care of. Substantial bollards were built around the portal legs as further protection against possible derailment. As the contract's third spring came tentatively in, the laying of cast iron curb drainage units signaled the final stage of deck laying, the asphalt surfacing. A total of 20,000 tons of blacktop